Afternoon and welcome. Thank you for being a part of today's series. The College of Sciences is pleased to announce a distinguished speaker series to celebrate the diversity of contributors to outstanding scholarship in the natural and social sciences. The intention of the series is to promote diversity and inclusion among our faculty and students by bringing highly successful academics from historically underrepresented backgrounds to UCF. Additionally, important goals of the series are to encourage UCF undergraduates from historically underrepresented backgrounds to continue their pursuits in the natural and social sciences, and to enrich graduate students' professional development by providing opportunities to interact with diverse faculty. And so this is a phenomenal time for us. And without further ado, I want to bring in Dr. Jonathan Cox, who is going to take us on our journey today. Thank you all for being here.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to the College of Sciences Distinguished Speaker Series. I am Dr. Jonathan Cox, an assistant professor of sociology here at UCF. Now, on behalf of the Department of Sociology, who's a co-sponsor for this event, I extend the warmest of welcomes to all of you, and I'm very thrilled that you were able to join us. I hope that you're as excited as I am to hear from our honored guest. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I did want to take some time just to briefly acknowledge two graduate students from the UCF Department of Biology who were instrumental in the creation of the College of Sciences Distinguished Speaker Series, Jordan Dowell and Ian Will. Reflecting concerns from graduate students in biology that the University and College of Sciences could be doing more in response to the ongoing Black Lives Matter protests and to live out espoused priorities for diversity and inclusivity, Jordan and Ian, they took it upon themselves to present a detailed proposal for a visiting scholars program focused on bringing diverse, emerging, and established leaders in research. Now, their efforts, in conjunction with support from biology and the College of Sciences, led to this distinguished speaker series. Now, I can also express my appreciation for such highly involved, socially conscious graduate students. So in my own department, several of our Black graduate students recently came together to write a letter expressing concern over some of their negative experiences in our department. And as a result, we've committed to restructuring our program to be more intentionally inclusive and anti-racist in both curriculum and climate. And today's co-sponsorship is a direct result of this new work. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for the day. Dr. Earl Wright II is a professor of sociology at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. He earned a BA in history and an MA in sociology from the University of Memphis. Dr. Wright completed his doctorate in sociology at the University of Nebraska, where he founded a chapter of the Black Graduate Student Association. After finishing his doctorate, Dr. Wright joined the Department of Sociology and Anthropology right here at the University of Central Florida. And over his career, he served on faculty at Fisk University, Texas Southern University, the University of Cincinnati, and now at Rhodes College. Dr. Wright has authored numerous books and articles on the contributions of African Americans and historically Black colleges and universities to the discipline of sociology. He is the nation's leading authority on W.E.B. Du Bois and the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, the moniker that was bestowed on scholars engaged in sociological inquiry at Atlanta University, which is now called Clark Atlanta University, between 1895 and 1917. And his groundbreaking research has altered our understanding of the discipline's formative years in this nation. Now, it's because of his excellence in research on race in the South that he was presented with the Charles S. Johnson Award by the Southern Sociological Society in 2016. Dr. Wright is currently co-editor of the highly rated journal Social Problems, is past president of the Association of Black Sociologists and the Mid-South Sociological Society, and was recently elected president of the nation's second largest professional sociological organization, the Southern Sociological Society. So please join me in giving a hearty virtual welcome to Dr. Earl Wright II.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Stewart. And let me say thank you for the invitation to be here with you, but also a special thank you to Dr. Lynn Huff-Corzine and Dr. Jonathan Cox and the planning committee and all those who were involved in bringing me back to UCF. It is good to be back among family, if only virtually. I was a member of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology for 4 years, from 2000 to 2004, and I have nothing but fond memories of my colleagues, some of whom are no longer with us. I have fond memories of students from UCF, some of which I still maintain contact with. And I have very fond memories of the institution that has grown by leaps and bounds. So it is indeed my honor to be your speaker for today. I want to begin by paying homage to trailblazers in the discipline of sociology. Now, I want to make it known that this is not something that I do just in February for Black History Month. This is a regular part of my presentations because I believe there are many of those who have made contributions to the discipline who have not been properly recognized. And I'll begin with James R.L. Diggs, the first African-American to take the PhD with a specialty in sociology. Next, we have Richard R. Wright. Wright is normally identified as the first person to take the PhD in sociology. However, this is only true if you specify that it came from a department of sociology. And last but certainly not least, the first Black American woman to take the PhD in sociology, Anna Johnson Julian, who, like Wright, took her degree from the University of Pennsylvania. My journey to this discipline started many years ago. I spent a great deal of my youth living with my grandmother. And my grandmother, unlike at my mother's home, she had a bookshelf. And in my child mind's eye, there appeared to be hundreds of books on that shelf. But in reality, there may have been 10 or 15. But there were 3 that really stood out to me. One, of course, is familiar to most Southern Baptist households, the Bible. And we were very familiar with that. We went to church most days of the week, whether we wanted to or not. So we had to become familiar with the Bible. Another book, Roots. I was really fascinated by Roots when I saw it, but it was so voluminous that I figured I'll just wait for the movie, the television series, to watch it. But there was another book that really shaped who I am today. And that was a book that had the word Negro in the title. And it was written by a man with a funny name. The book was called The Philadelphia Negro, written by William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. And unlike Roots, for some reason I was attracted to the Philadelphia Negro, and I began to read it. Although at the age of 9 or 10, I could barely pronounce many of the words, didn't understand most of what I was reading, but I was fascinated by the meticulously drawn maps that Du Bois included. Little did I know that as this book faded from my memory, that years later, it will be the inspiration for what I call my life's work, which is my research on the contributions of Blacks and historically Black institutions to the discipline of sociology. As an undergraduate, I took a class from Dr. David Acey at the University of Memphis, a Black Studies course. And he would often share with us the story that he called A Well-Dressed Lie and the Naked Truth. And I thought about this story many times during my graduate student career. And as the story goes, the truth was walking to town one day. He lived in a rural area and he had to go to town to purchase some items. And it was a particularly hot day. Along the way, he came across a lie. Now, a lie and the truth were not friends, they were associates. They knew each other from a distance. While they were walking towards town, a lie came up with a great idea. He said to the truth, why don't we go swimming for a minute? It's hot out here and we need to cool off before we continue on our path to town. And the truth, unwittingly, knowing what the intentions of a lie was, said, okay, let's go swimming. And he stripped down to his bathing suit, and the truth jumped into the water. And he swam as fast as he could, as far as he could, while the lie was lollygagging around. The lie waited until the truth was almost out of sight, at a very far distance. And the lie, who was not as well kept as the truth, who was wearing hazard clothes, had a decent odor to him, began to put on the clothing of the truth. Before the truth could get out of water to catch up with him, a lie was already headed to town, ready to tell tales of his grandeur and to convince town folks that he was someone he was not. What did he run to town as? He ran to town as a well-dressed lie, wearing the clothing of the truth and putting out the aura of the truth. Well, this is what I felt as a graduate student, as I was in a militaristic fashion being fed the great contributions of white American sociologists, particularly those of the Chicago School. And I constantly felt that something wasn't right, something's missing. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I believed dearly that I was being fed a line of well-dressed lies through the discipline of sociology. Then one day, I remember where that distaste came from. I reflected and thought back to my grandmother's bookshelf. My discomfort stemmed from the fact that the University of Chicago was supposed to have been the first to engage in urban sociological study, the first to engage in ethnographic research, the first to really look at a city as a unit of measurement and study. And in my mind, I wondered, why is the Philadelphia Negro not being discussed? Why is Du Bois not being discussed? And that spurred my interest into W.E.B. Du Bois and his contributions. But it also made me wonder, why were the contributions of Southern sociologists not included in the discipline? We're all familiar with the works of William Graham Sumner, who taught the first course in sociology at Yale University in 1873. But little did we know that the second institution to teach a course in sociology was the University of Arkansas. Why? What's the connection? And through my research, and as I'll discuss in detail in a minute, Atlanta University became the first American school of sociology and made many contributions to the discipline. Both of these institutions are located in the American South. But when we wax poetically about the early origins of the discipline, we focus nearly exclusively on the American Northeast and the Midwest. But before I discuss the contributions of Blacks and HBCUs to sociology, I must properly frame the origin of the discipline in the US, and not necessarily the rose-tinted, vanilla, and corporate version of the glorious evolution of sociology in America. Instead, I must begin with the underbelly of the discipline, the part we never want to discuss, the part we tend to gloss over. And I begin by using the research conducted by L.L. Barnard, who was a sociologist at the University of North Carolina, who makes the argument that if you really look at it substantively, sociology began in the American South. When we read introduction to sociology textbooks, when we read histories of the discipline, one would never have figured that out or thought that to be the case. In fact, he makes a strong argument that sociology became what it was because of the way that it was practiced at historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs. And that he understood there was a different brand of sociology taking place at HBCUs as compared to mainstream sociological, predominantly white institutions. Now, what is interesting to note for Bernard is he was a colleague of Howard W. Odom, the person who is commonly attributed with being the first to engage in regionalized sociological study. The idea that L.L. Bernard, who is his colleague, would argue that African Americans, HBCUs, were the first to do those works are really telling. So what is it about these early years in sociology that as a discipline, we want to hide under the rug? We want to make disappear. If you look at the traditional accounts of the first book with the title Sociology in it, normally we're directed to Herbert Spencer and his 1873 book, The Study of Sociology. However, 20 years prior, there were two textbooks that were written by Southerners, and these textbooks were used in academic courses throughout the South, throughout the nation. One is titled Sociology for the South, and the other, Treatise on Sociology. But what is, or what was, sociology of the South? To use the term that best applies, it was gobbledygook, a social philosophy based on profound guesses, stupid utterances, and blatant paradoxes. It was a way for the white South to rationalize and validate the continuation of inequality and segregation in the United States. This is how the discipline emerged in the United States. But this is the narrative, unfortunately, that is little discussed. For Fitzhugh and Hughes, and as I write in my latest book, Jim Crow Sociology, they wanted to maintain the racial order that existed during the years of Black enslavement. It is possible that one of the reasons we do not call upon these books as foundational texts is because of the lack of methodology or scientific data. And I'll address that in a few minutes. But first, we must point to the rationale for the studies in the first place. George Fitzhugh makes the argument that sociology was needed in places that did not embrace slavery. So in his book, he argues that in order for societies to work perfectly, they must embrace the institution of slavery. And had the United States been waiting on sociology to develop here, it would not have. And that the solution for European countries, non-American countries, to have fruitful societies that develop in functional lines, they must embrace slavery. So in essence, he's promoting the benevolence, the continuation of enslavement in the United States. Fitzhugh does something similarly. And what he does is he travels around the South. He gathers the opinions of white Southerners and their thoughts on slavery. Now, keep in mind, these books were published in 1854, more than a decade until the peculiar institution of slavery was ended. What were the major conclusions drawn by Hughes? That slavery is morally and civilly good. But the methods of data collection were less than desirable. But the basic premise, again, these were the foundations of sociology in the United States. Sociology of the South, a practice that we distance ourselves from. But let us not be distracted to think that only Fitzhugh and Hughes were the ones engaged in this sociological malpractice. The idea that one did not use scientific methods of research to ascertain the problems of the day. The American Journal of Sociology established in 1895, curiously the same year as the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, had similar works that depicted races in stereotypical ways, with the key element: they were not bound by sound methodology, or in many cases, a method of research at all. They were the musings, or as Du Bois would call it, the car window sociological assessments of those who had pre-existing notions that were validated. And there are many examples here, but I just want to show a couple from the American Journal of Sociology, which was in theory the leading journal. But we'll see when we compare the products of the American Journal of Sociology with the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, the methodological sophistication of the ASL far exceeded that of what was taking place in the day. We look fondly at the Chicago School of Sociology, but in retrospect, we have to ask ourselves, should we have placed them within the canon, given what we know, both then and now? Several years ago, Jennifer Platt conducted a study where she looked at the methodological rigor of the famed Chicago School of Sociology, which prior to my works in the early 2000s, was considered the first American school of sociology. After an examination of various studies by faculty at Chicago, she concluded that, they really didn't care what type of data they obtained. Didn't document if it was original data, where it came from, how many people were interviewed, or people that data were collected from. And they often lent themselves to including generalizations as opposed to scientific, concrete fact and data. Now, it's in this sociological environment, in this American racial milieu, that Atlanta University decides in 1895 to begin a series of studies on Black Americans. Why did they start these studies? They were receiving correspondences from graduates who were living in small and rural towns, who wanted to know about the transitions that were taking place. How were the transitions from rural to urban living impacting Blacks? How was the transition from enslavement to freedom impacting Blacks? And they figured no one was better suited at this time than Atlanta University. Now, the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory started prior to Du Bois's arrival. Du Bois elevated it to another level. But when it started, it was under the guidance of John Howard Hinks, a white social scientist who, although he introduced the discipline to the university, had to teach around sociology. Why did he have to teach around sociology? Because the white citizens of Atlanta, Georgia understood how liberatory an education could become. They did not want the local Blacks to be too empowered. And there were in fact threats to kill Hinks and Atlanta University students if they taught courses dealing directly with sociology, the liberating potential of sociology. The Atlanta studies, as I said, was started prior to Du Bois's arrival by George G. Bradford and President Horace Bumstead, but it was Du Bois who elevated it to another level. For Du Bois, his ideal study would have consisted of 100 years of data collection. 100 years where they would address one topic each year and thoroughly investigate that topic. They would revisit that topic 10 years later to assess any changes, to note if things have improved, and how to recondition the data, the findings to best improve the life outcomes and life chances of Black Americans. Now, what's unique about the Atlanta University studies is, whereas we are in our silos today, our individual silos, their works were very interdisciplinary. One year, they would study education. The next year, they would focus on medicine, criminal justice after that, business and economics, and also leisure were topics of conversation. They wanted a very holistic understanding of the lives and livelihood of Black Americans. Toward the end of his life, Du Bois lamented his inability to see to fruition this 100-year program of study on Blacks in America. He suggested that if he had been able to complete it, he would have wanted to develop a theory on the economic assimilation of a non-white group into the United States, and data that could be used for groups that would follow Black Americans. Unfortunately, this did not come to fruition, in part because of a lack of funding. Atlanta University started as a publicly funded institution. However, shortly after its establishment, the state of Georgia legislature came to the university and made a declaration. We want you to stop admitting white students into your school. If you don't, we will withdraw funding from you. Atlanta University President Horace Bumstead stood up to the Georgia legislature and said, no, we will not discriminate against students based on their color. In fact, most of the white students who attended Atlanta University were children of faculty who worked there. So because of Atlanta University's unwillingness to be discriminatory in its admissions practices, the school lost substantial amounts of funding and eventually had to seek philanthropic support from individuals who would become angered by Du Bois's works at the school. What we found when I began studying the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory is a laundry list of first accomplishments. One of the first studies to push back against the scientific racism against Black Americans was Du Bois's study of the health and physique of the Negro American. Published in 1906, this study was years ahead of its time, where using students from Hampton University, they collected data that proved and concluded rather, that there were no biological or intellectual differences between Black and white students, or Black and whites in general. The first study of the Negro, first study of the church rather, was conducted by W.E.B. Du Bois and the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory. Not the white church, not the Black church, but the first scientific study of the church. The first study of the American family was conducted by Du Bois and the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory. But when you look at each of these substantive areas, you will find no recognition of these facts. Unfortunately, what you will also not find, increasingly so, I'll say, but not in abundance, are there contributions beyond the area of race. I submit that as a discipline, sociology has been slow to acknowledge the contributions of W.E.B. Du Bois and other Black sociologists. Unfortunately, when they are mentioned, it's only within the realm of race, or primarily within the realm of race. So in many ways, they're ghettoized, as if their works were only applicable to race. But if you look beyond the veil, as Du Bois calls it, you will see their contributions extended to many other areas. Now, they say mother is the necessity is the mother of invention. The Atlanta Sociological Laboratory did not intend to make these contributions. They were forced to make these contributions. Which contributions are we talking about? Insider researchers. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, even the most well-meaning white researcher would not be able to gain reliable data on Blacks if he's seeking information concerning wealth, household income, How many people live in the home? What's the status of the persons living in the home? Why? This is the era of Jim Crow, where the Ku Klux Klan could kill an individual at their whim, where there are many documented cases of Blacks who owned substantial amounts of land were killed simply because they refused to give that information or give that land over. Now, in the 1990s, that's when this idea of insider researchers became the rave. That if we're conducting interviews, we need someone who matches the social characteristics of the interviewee. But I submit to you that this was a common practice that predated Du Bois at Atlanta University in 1895. When we look at our methods textbooks, there is no mention of their contribution. Triangulation, the use of two or more methods of research to solve a problem. Standard practice by the all-Black sociologists at this institution. Limitations section. Du Bois and Atlanta University officials understood very early that the research findings produced by this all-Black cadre of scholars would be received lukewarmly. They understood that there would be some speculation about the objectivity of the data. And there are some scholars who even wrote that the purpose of the Atlanta studies was to improve the morale of Black Americans, regardless of the data findings. To fend off this accusation, Du Bois and the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory acknowledged in their 20 publications the failings of that particular study. More often than not, they cited a lack of finances as to the incompleteness of studies. They cited the lack of ability to find citizen researchers to help them collect data in various counties. But the idea that they were the first collection of sociological scholars to introduce a limitations section or a statement in their research is profound. It is something that, unfortunately, as with the insider researchers, is not acknowledged when you look at methods textbooks. The Atlanta Sociological Laboratory was the first to include a methods section in their paper. Again, understanding that their research will be met with skepticism. So they articulated where the data came from, how many data were received, from where. This predated Du Bois also in 1895. If you remember, I mentioned the American Journal of Sociology, the leading publication for the discipline that began the same year as the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory. While the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory initiated its methods section in 1895, it wasn't until 1912, W.I. Thomas, that AJS had its first methods section in a paper that was published by that outlet. Methods sections in American Journal of Sociology articles did not become commonplace until well into the 20s. So another example of how W.E.B. Du Bois and the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory were way ahead of their time, and why they should not be ghettoized again into studies or research dealing only with race. Their scope, their reach, their impact was much greater than that. It was at this time that I understood there was something going on here, that the type of sociology being practiced at Atlanta University was different than what one would see at the University of Chicago. It wasn't very different than what we saw with the work of Fitzhugh and Hughes. What I noticed with Black sociology is that they began to view the discipline as a tool and a weapon to fight for their human rights, to back up, to fight against, push back against scientific racism. those books that were being read by students, written by Fitzhugh and Hughes. They were pushing back against all those dehumanizing studies, and I use air quotes for studies. So there was a parallel world taking place. The question for me at this point became, was Atlanta University and Du Bois just the exception? Or are there others who engaged in works of Black sociology? And for there to be a Black sociology, the late Tom Calhoun and I came up with these criteria: that the work must be conducted primarily, but not exclusively, by Black scholars. And that's in the tradition of the standpoint theory, to where you cannot define a position that you do not occupy, but you can be assist in the development of it if you're not in the community. That the research must center on the experiences of Blacks. Now, this seems commonsensical, but at this time, the late 1800s, early 1900s, studies that focused on Blacks viewed them from a deficit perspective. It was our desire to center the experiences of Blacks from an asset perspective. How were you able to survive during Jim Crow American apartheid? How are you able to prosper in a region where you could be killed for simply looking a white person in the eye? That is why we wanted to come at this Black sociological perspective from a non-deficit perspective. The research must be interdisciplinary. I mentioned this previously. The findings, whenever possible, must be generalizable. And this is an important point. Simply because the research was conducted on Blacks doesn't mean that it's not generalizable to populations beyond the Black community. And lastly, whenever possible, the research should have social policy implications. Again, Black sociologists, Du Bois, Johnson, Lucy Laney, they were looking for solutions to the problems for Black Americans. And sociology was their vehicle. So as I'm scouring the literature to see if there are other schools who engaged in works similar to Du Bois in Atlanta, I came across this phenomenon that existed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it was called Negro conferences. And this is where various HBCUs would hold yearly conferences and address a particular topic. Obviously, for Atlanta University, it was on the scientific study of primarily urban Black Americans. I also discovered that Hampton Institute, now Hampton University, held a yearly conference. Their focus was on industry and technology. And then I came across the Tuskegee Negro Conference. And this really fascinated me because we tend to think of W.E.B. Du Bois as being opposed to liberal arts education, as being opposed to sociology. He did not oppose it in so much as he wanted to use it in ways that would help him assist in achieving his long-term goals. We must remember that in Atlanta, Georgia, you could have been killed for trying to study sociology, this liberating discipline. In rural Alabama, Washington did not want to expose his students to that same type of threat, but in a clandestine way, used the discipline to achieve his own goals. And what was that? Engagement in rural sociology. John Gillette wrote the first pure textbook on rural sociology in 1913. And this is his definition here of what rural sociology is. And in a nutshell, it suggests that one simply studies the rural environment and comes up with ways to better the life outcomes and life conditions of its residents. And to me, that reads exactly like applied rural sociology. When Gillette updated his definition some 10 years later, he talks about the systematic way in that the study of rural communities should take place, with the ultimate goal being to formulate principles of progress. Again, applied rural sociology. I mined the archives of Tuskegee University to discover what was taking place at these yearly conferences. And also I read the autobiography of Booker T. Washington. And this is a quote from Booker T. about the rationale for establishing the yearly conferences. He wanted to find out the actual condition of the masses, gather the data, and then use that data to help lift the masses of people. Applied sociology. So no, Atlanta University was not the only one engaged in Black sociology, the liberatory potential of sociology. Tuskegee did it also, although not as overtly as Du Bois in Atlanta. So at these yearly conferences, Booker T. Washington would encourage attendees to provide firsthand data, and he admonished them to be as accurate as possible. Do not rely on generalizations. Be specific with the data. In many ways, this can be compared to complete member participant observation that these attendees engaged in prior to attending the conference. And they also promoted what he called, literally, in the Tuskegee conference publications, they advertised it as one day of practical sociology, where they would talk about the data collection. Again, these accounts from persons who used the techniques learned from Tuskegee the previous year, who came back to report on the success or lack thereof of that information. The analysis, teasing out the most salient parts and practices of agriculture and farming. And then the application, taking the information that they learned to the people, to the masses. What were some of the results? New school buildings erected in places that needed them for Black students. The length of the school year being increased. Because we understand that during this time of America's agricultural emphasis, the school year was determined by crops and harvesting. If you were needed in the fields, that's where you would be, and you would not be in a school. But because of Washington's study, yearly study, they found that it was beneficial to have the school year lengthened. Financial literacy was very important. Often we talk about Du Bois's battle with Washington and that Du Bois was vehemently opposed to vocational education. He was not. And he wrote about this in The Souls of Black Folks. He did not oppose technical or vocational education. He simply believed that before you can become a business person, you should at least know how to read, how to write, how to solve mathematical problems, count money. So he encouraged financial literacy. And this is what Washington did with the yearly studies. And of course, Washington was interested in improving the racial conditions of the era. How did this applied rural sociology spread? Tuskegee officials would sponsor community conferences throughout the United States. So the attendees of the yearly Tuskegee meetings would return back to their communities, share with the masses what they learned, so that they each could benefit from that information. On Tuskegee's campus, they established courses for residents of the area to learn more about agriculture and farming. It was not limited to just men. Families were invited to participate and take this course. And what initially started out as a class of 11 persons, by the time it reached its climax, over 1,500 people were involved in the short course in agriculture. And probably the most unique aspect of Tuskegee's applied rural sociology was the idea of a movable school, a traveling school, where for those for whom it was too far to travel to Tuskegee, either for the yearly conference or the short course in agriculture, they would send a caravan to your community. They traveled as far as Arizona, far west as Arizona, far north as Illinois, and up to Maryland, and of course throughout the entire South. So, although for many people it's anathema to associate Booker T. Washington with sociology, and especially the embrace of sociology, when we look at the development of rural sociology, they play a central role. And this slide is just to provide a visual context for where Tuskegee was compared to their contemporaries who engaged in rural sociology. The first course in rural sociology, 1894, C.R. Henderson at the University of Chicago. The landmark study by President Roosevelt that really sparked interest in developing this thing called rural sociology was released in 1909. And of course, in 1912, the American Sociological Association established a section. And in 1937, the Rural Sociology Society was established. When I examine the history of rural sociology, nowhere do I find accounts of the contributions of Booker T. Washington and the Tuskegee scholars. These are all narratives that need to change. This is why there must be a holistic infusion of the contributions of Blacks and HBCUs to this discipline, and I'm sure others. So now we come to the question, why have these accomplishments not been included in the literature? And I borrowed this title, Why Black People Tend to Shout, from the late Ralph Wiley, a sports columnist from my hometown of Memphis, Tennessee, who wrote a book by that name. What he suggests is a person can only whisper or say in a calm voice how they should be respected, how they should be treated, that they should be heard. Sometimes you can only gain one's attention when you begin to shout. So in my attempt to understand why the contributions of Blacks and HBCUs have been minimized and ignored, 5 things pop to mind. 1, academic obscurity. The idea that, well, maybe white sociologists just did not know about the research at Atlanta or Tuskegee. Well, this argument is knocked down when you read the volumes of the Atlanta University Studies, where they document to whom publications were sent and who requested publications. So publications were received to faculty at many Ivy League institutions on the East Coast, Stanford University, Berkeley on the West Coast, and even to high school teachers in Appalachia. So the idea that they suffer from some academic obscurity is not accurate. The same for Booker T. Washington, who was a strong advocate for Tuskegee. And it's documented in newspapers how he would often, or always rather, promote what was taking place at his school. Well, maybe the findings are not generalizable. That's why the studies have been ignored. It's only if you look at them through a racialized lens that this argument could possibly make sense. One particular study I'll bring to your attention, I believe the 1906-7 study of the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, where they concluded that there was a high rate of consumption of what we call now tuberculosis for persons living in poorly ventilated apartment buildings. Well, that finding is ungeneralizable only if Blacks were the only ones living in poorly ventilated apartment buildings. But we know those findings apply to whites and other groups who are living in those same conditions. So again, you have to move beyond Du Bois's veil. Number 3, I'm not going to address because we went over the methods of research, and it's hilarious that the scholar would even bring up this argument, the idea that the methods were of low quality and unsophisticated, especially when compared to the quote unquote leading scholars of Du Bois's day. The lack of theory. Now, if you consider a theory a set of interrelated statements that attempt to explain or predict social phenomena and are replicable and generalizable, then Atlanta University did produce theory. But they are not presented in the format that is acceptable by today's scholars. They are presented as resolutions at the end of each publication. And lastly, and most notably, racism. We know that during this era, for many white Americans, there was the idea that Blacks were a different type of human, subhuman. There was no way that they could possibly produce any data, any findings, any research that could be comparable to that conducted by scholars from well-resourced institutions, including Chicago, Columbia, Stanford, and what have you. So, in conclusion, as I close this talk, let me share with you that figuratively, I've seen from a distance the image of someone coming to notify us, in the words of the great Sam Cooke, that a change is gonna come. In the distance, I see the naked truth, the unabashed truth, the undeniable truth that this discipline must, and I repeat, must reckon with. And that is, it was founded in earnest upon the shoulders of Black men and women who believed it could help them improve their condition in this nation via the scientific method. And in so doing, elevated the scientific bona fides of the discipline to such a degree that it is now recognized as a legitimate area of scientific inquiry. It is now time for the discipline to recognize the efforts of these individuals by infusing them into the canon of great sociological thinkers and practitioners. Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much, Dr. Wright, for that incredibly insightful talk on the origins of sociology. I know I really enjoyed the whole concept of a well-dressed lie. I thought that was just so enlightening. Now, I'm sure many people who are listening are walking away with a completely new understanding of how integral Black Americans have been in constructing the field as we know it. And so at this point, what we would love to do is open up the floor for some questions that some of the viewers might have for Dr. Wright. So if you have questions, please submit them via the Q&A field that you should see on your screen. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So first question that we have for you, Dr. Wright, is that earlier in your talk, you mentioned the idea of a new Jim Crow. Now, I think most people who maybe have heard this word have heard it in relation to Michelle Alexander's work on mass incarceration. But could you maybe unpack this concept a little bit more for us, both broadly and as it relates specifically to your work?
If I mentioned precisely the concept new Jim Crow, then there was a mistake. But what I will say is one of the things that piqued my curiosity a few years ago when the new Jim Crow came out is the lack of attention that was paid to the works of W.E.B. Du Bois and the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, who wrote about a similar process, the convict lease system that was in place after the formal end of slavery. And it was a shadow form of slavery, similar to sharecropping. And the convict leasing system worked as such. If you were not gainfully employed, could not demonstrate you had a job, you could be arrested. If there were 2 or more Black people standing on a corner, they could be arrested. And as a side note, we wonder why when young Black men see the police coming, They run instinctively. You know, that's something that has a historical background there. And your talent, your labor will be leased out to the highest bidder for a profit that will be consumed by the local sheriff and townspeople. So it's interesting to note that when the book came out, I was looking forward to seeing that contextualized, but it wasn't included in a way that I thought was very substantive.
Great, thank you. So another question that we have from a viewer is that they were asking, have you found any evidence that Walter Wright was influenced by the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory?
No, I've not found any information on Walter Wright. If we're talking about Walter Wright of the NAACP, in fact, he was leery of Du Bois and Du Bois's influence on the NAACP because, and this goes back to my statement on Atlanta University's need for philanthropic gifts after the state withdrew funding. Excuse me. Du Bois's studies were racially charged for that time. The idea that you're telling white America that they have these deficiencies that they need to address, that they are being called to task for the inequality they're perpetrating on Black Americans. A lot of philanthropic donors to Atlanta University didn't take too kindly for that. And many of them began to withhold funding from the university because of that, those research studies. Du Bois in 1913 fell on his sword, where he basically said, if I'm the cause for the university to lose money and suffer financially, then I will simply resign. I'll withdraw myself. When he joined the NAACP, there was a similar fear of many in administrative positions that Du Bois's sharp discussions of race would alienate some of their donors, largely white philanthropic donors and white supporters. We found that there was a minimal impact on donations, but nothing substantive. So Walter Wright, he watched from a distance, but was never, in terms of my research that I found, directly involved in pushing Du Bois one way or another towards not engaging critically in issues of race, partly because the crisis at that time was self-funding. It was only during the latter part of Du Bois's career with the NAACP that the crisis was no longer self-sustaining, and he needed the approval of the board of directors to write certain things. But while it was self-sustaining, there was no such issue.
Thank you. All right, so the next question we have from a viewer is, what recommendations would you make to faculty who teach the required sociological theory course for undergrads for ways to teach a more inclusive history of the discipline?
There is an article that I wrote about 8 years ago in Teaching Sociology, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but it's how, where, and when to infuse the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory into the sociology curriculum. And it's very easy to do. One is to be aware of the latest research that's taking place. So although interest in Du Bois and the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory has gained momentum over the last 4 or 5 years, this work has been out there for about 20 years. And for many of us, we are hesitant to infuse new information into our courses if it's not already in the intro to sociology textbook. So we must be willing to go the extra step to make sure that there is inclusion on all levels. And I say that because I view my job, my research job, as helping to put together this puzzle. And for me, I'm putting together the sociology puzzle, the pieces on the contributions of Blacks. But it's also important to have other areas. A recent article that I published with a graduate student at Cincinnati, Marcus Brooks, the article is on Augustus Granville Deal. who was an early Black male queer sociologist and a member of Du Bois's Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, or the ASL, as I call it, and his engagement in public sociology. So there was this big hubbub about public sociology with Michael Burroway of the American Sociological Association many years ago, but there were others in the Black sociological tradition who have been doing that. So I would say expand your networks, your professional networks. Ask younger scholars who are fresh in the literature consistently, what is out there that I need to be made aware of? And I'm sure you'll come across some very interesting material.
Right. So we have another question from a viewer says, were there any findings in your research that included contributions of Black women during these earlier times?
Great question. With the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, yes, but there was limited data. And in my latest book, I highlight two persons, Georgia Swift King and Lucy Laney. They are significant because they were members of the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory prior to Du Bois's entry. And they maintained their membership well after he departed in 1913. Lucy Laney is largely known for establishing, I believe, the first kindergarten and the first public school for Blacks in the state of Georgia, and also the first Black high school football team. Very little is known about her efforts with the Atlanta Laboratory. And she's significant because she was offering what Pat Hill Collins calls this commonplace or taken for granted knowledge in the quote unquote women's meetings, because they actually held separate meetings, one meeting for men, a separate convening for women. And I was discussing with my class today, wondering how different the theoretical musings of Black men on issues of Blackness in America may have been changed had Lucy Laney been able to present her data on mothering to that crowd. And in particular, she made the argument that, and this was in 1904, that parents, both men and women, treat their sons differently than their daughters. And that there should not be this specific notion of gender roles, adherence to one's gender role, that you may stunt the development of one or the other, and you should be more holistic in how we treat them. So there are many contributions by women of the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, but there's not much data out there. Unless you were meticulous like W.E.B. Du Bois and you kept record upon record upon record of your correspondences, your rough drafts, unless you did that, much of what we know is lost to history, or should know is lost to history.
Great, yeah, thank you. All right, so another question we have is, what steps can modern sociologists take to return sociology to its liberatory roots?
Well, that's part of the fight right now in the discipline. The idea of public sociology, or what some would call me-search, as opposed to real scholarship, which is purely positivistic, hands-off, let the data speak for themselves, and everything is completely objective. But we know that there's subjectivity in the research question that we ask, and in other ways down the line. What I see happening really is sociology is coming back home, because many of us now understand, well, if we have a true understanding of the discipline, we know that it was not established simply to produce data and let data sit there. You know, the books behind me, you know, what if I'd written all of those books? It would be nice to have them sitting on my shelf, looking nice, pat myself on the back, you know, yay me. But what is my research doing for the people? And what I see with the debate in sociology today turning to are the origins of Black sociology, or what is really true sociology, the idea that you should conduct research for a purpose. And that purpose should be to help understand, explain, and or improve the condition of members of a society.
Good. And so along similar lines, we had another viewer who was asking a question that I think fits really well with what you were just saying. And so they were asking that in your listing of the various tenets of Black sociology in particular, you indicated that it had or has an explicit commitment to improving the lives of Blacks, which speaks to what you were just saying. So then can you talk a little bit more about, or maybe speak to those who might feel that such a commitment in and of itself is not, quote unquote, scientific?
Mm-hmm. As long as one engages in the scientific method, understanding their positionality, understanding their possible biases, and they gather data in the most scientific and rigorous way possible, that should not diminish what those findings are or what the purpose of the research is. And referring specifically to those 5 principles of Black sociology, if I remember correctly, it is that it should ideally have social policy implications. Now, many of us aren't comfortable promoting scholarship through social policy and promoting that policy. And Du Bois himself had issues with that during his years as a practicing sociology, where he suggested that I'm going to collect the data, I'm going to produce the findings, and I will put it in the hands of interested parties. And maybe for some who suggest that true scholarship should be not interactive with people or not have such a direct end result, maybe that is an outlet for them to express that.
Absolutely. And so we have a question from somebody who has very clearly read your book, which is great. And so they write that, so in chapter 6 of your book ends with, I will find a way or make one. And so what they want to know is, how does this relate to young sociologists today? And then related, they say, you also call the chapter Whither Black Sociology. And would you mind unpacking that?
I will find a way or make one. That's the motto from Atlanta University. And I find that every time I see it on that emblem, on that crest, to be very inspirational, but also informative of the era that they were living. Despite whatever challenges that may come, they will find a way to positively impact the lives, institutional-wise, of their students, and for their faculty of sociology to positively impact the lives of people for whom research is being conducted. The way that it relates to young sociologists of today, I think we're seeing it on a daily basis, especially for those of us sociologists who are on social media. I am heartened by what I'm seeing in terms of the creativity of the sociological ideas and methods of data collection for young scholars. And I would encourage them to abide by the motto from Atlanta University. Regardless of the situation, find a way or make one. And in the chapter, Whither Black Sociology, I'll unpack that chapter by going a bit further into the book, Jim Crow Sociology. There are always manifest and latent outcomes of events. Often we can look at an event in real time as positive, but later on, wonder how things would be different. And that's what I was thinking in that chapter, Whither Black Sociology. While we are all grateful for and benefit from the Supreme Court decision of 1954 to strike down Brown versus Board of Education, the only reason we had this golden era of Black sociology and the ruling of the discipline, I would say, by Black sociologists at HBCUs is because of segregation. Once segregation ended, then persons like myself had to make, as they say on the football field, if you don't want to tackle someone, you You run for the dirt so you don't hurt yourself. We had to make business decisions. Do we want to work at highly resourced institutions? Or do we want to work at institutions that don't have as many resources? Many of our first generation sociologists, which I identify as roughly the 1960s, 1960 through 1980, made the decision to work at predominantly white institutions. So you had this vacuum where Atlanta University, Tuskegee, were no longer attracting the high level talent. So I propose that there emerged a dark age of Black sociology, where it really did not exist, except in theory and on paper. And that was, excuse me, until the development of Black studies. Because when you look at some of the principles of Black sociology that I mentioned, they are very comparable to the tenets of Black studies. And that's what I include in that chapter. So we may no longer have quote unquote Black sociology, but in spirit, what we see in Black studies or Africana studies is an extension of what Du Bois and Monroe Nathan Work and Tuskegee did many, many years ago.
Very good, thank you. All right, another question, one that a lot of people really seem to be interested in getting the answer to, and I understand why. Can you recommend any intro to sociology textbooks that are providing more inclusive approaches to the history of sociology and the contributions of diverse sociologists?
There is one, I cannot think of his name, and I'm not sure if it's still in rotation. His name escapes me now, but sadly, other than that, no. I'm teaching Intro to Sociology now, and I am going back to like the statement you mentioned about how to infuse these works into the classroom. I basically skip over half of that chapter. I'll present the quote unquote founders, but then I go directly into Du Bois, Jane Addams, Lucy Laney, even Ida B. Wells and her contributions that were sociological in nature and are begrudgingly becoming accepted by mainstream sociologists. But yeah, it's killing me. I can't remember his name right now, but if I do, I'll raise that again.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, we definitely didn't mean to put you on the spot in that sense, but that is, again, that was just a question that a lot of people have, and I can imagine that based on your enlightening talk again, and folks hopefully now wanting to be a little bit more inclusive, they would like to know. And so I would echo for sure what you said before, which is go out and look for these things. There are, as I tell my own students a lot, right? Google is an awesome tool. Go out there and look, go ask some of the younger people. I think that's great. All right, so another question that we have, should there be a collective effort to continue the vision of Du Bois and continue with his 100-year plan?
By all means, by all means. And ideally, in my ideal world, that would be grounded in the HBCUs of this country. And ideally, Howard would be the main leader, since Howard University is the only HBCU that offers the PhD in sociology. So you would need to have those institutions that have great resources or enough resources. And it's similar to what the first principle of Black sociology is, that the research must be led primarily but not exclusively by Blacks. So we'll start with HBCUs and extend out to, like Du Bois wanted, the Ivy League institutions, the elite institutions, those who have resources in abundance to participate also. But for Du Bois, as we know, he approached Pennsylvania and Yale and Harvard with this idea, and they rebuffed him. But I would very much like to see that.
Yeah, absolutely, me as well. I didn't even know that Howard University was the only school where you could get a PhD in sociology. That's incredible news. So another question that we have is a viewer is saying that they've heard over and over this idea of rewriting the canon. So they want to know if you could speak to that a little bit. How can one go about rewriting the canon? They know that it may take a village, but we have to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, just by trying to reach as many people as possible and provide them with this new information or seemingly new information. But that takes labor on our part. It may take us out of our comfort zone in some respects. And on a very practical level, and this is something I've thought about, but don't have the time to do it or the energy right now, but to write our own inclusive introduction to sociology textbook. Again, that includes let's get beyond Du Bois, because one of the reasons I write about others in the Atlanta laboratory is to not deify him. Yes, he was a brilliant scholar. He made wonderful contributions, but Du Bois was not the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory himself. You had, again, Augustus Granville Deal, Black queer man. You had Lucy Laney, a Black woman. Then we need to bring in others, bring in the Jane Addams, the Florence, can't think of her last name, from Chicago also. So when we start writing our own books, we begin to change the playing field, to move the playing field to some degree. And maybe that's a project that someone can take up. I'd be ecstatic to see that maybe 2 or 3 people can take up. And I believe that would be, among other things, a moneymaker.
Absolutely. And so kind of along the lines of books, right, as people are looking at this. So another question we had was, in addition to your book, Jim Crow Sociology, and some works by Du Bois and some of the other individuals you mentioned, right, what are some books that you think should be required as part of our graduate theory curriculum, particularly for doctoral programs?
Required books. I'm not good at recalling many things, but I'll say definitely look at Alden Morris's work. That's really an extension of my work, whereas my work between 2000 to 2015 focused primarily on the Atlanta laboratory in total. Alden really took it to another level by focusing primarily on Du Bois, and Atlanta was secondary. So start with those. And even the works of, oh my God, I'm just blanking on all kinds of names today. But she just wrote the book on double consciousness with her colleague, John Itzson, Corita Brown. Corita and John Itzingen, I always mispronounce his name. But it's a book on double consciousness and the way that we should include Du Bois's work into theory courses also. And in addition to the methods courses and the other race courses, but again, to get beyond this idea of just limiting him to the sociological ghetto of race.
Absolutely. So thank you very much. All right, so I think those are all the questions that we have from the viewers. Those were some fantastic questions. Thank you very much for sticking around to answer these for us. And so in closing us out, I would just like to say on behalf of the UCF College of Sciences and your former home here, the Department of Sociology, I would like to express my deepest thanks to you, Dr. Wright, for spending your time with us today. We're all the better for hearing you. And to those who are in the virtual audience, thank you again for taking time out of your day to attend this talk. Definitely be sure to get your own copy of Dr. Wright's book. Again, that is Jim Crow Sociology, The Black and Southern Roots of American Sociology. And also stay on the lookout for the next Distinguished Speaker Series event. Just as a note, this talk was recorded and it will be available on the College of Sciences YouTube page. Lastly, for any graduate students who are in attendance today, Dr. Wright is going to be doing a closed session with graduate students very shortly at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. Central. The link will be in the chat shortly, and so it's not too late to register for that. But again, we're only asking that for this closed session that it's only graduate students who sign up. We really want to give a time and a space for Dr. Wright to share specifically with graduate students as they're matriculating through their own undergraduate programs. Finally, special thanks again to the College of Sciences and the Department of Sociology. I hope you all have a wonderful day and the rest of your week. Thank you very much.